Okay, welcome to the second lecture of Module 1, where we're going to be looking at methods of voting, tallying, and winning. In the previous lecture, I talked all about offices and office holders and the variety of questions that have to be sort of addressed in setting up a democratic society. And one of the questions, one of the issues is the selection method. And as I talked about in that last lecture, there are a lot of different selection methods. I mean, not a lot. There are big categories of selection methods. There's voting, there's appointment, there's hiring, and there's lottery or sortition. In this lecture, I'm going to focus on the one most familiar and most democratic seeming of the selection methods, and that is voting. And I just want you to know that the reason why I'm doing this is because this is a really commonly used, very important selection method, and I'm not going to drill down as deeply on the other methods, but that doesn't mean that they're not important. Setting up a system of appointment that makes sure that the people who fill appointed offices have the right kinds of characteristics and skills and inclinations and the right checks on them is very important. Same thing with the civil service hiring system. And I'm going to look a bit in the next lecture on the connection between selection methods and governance at all of the different methods. But I'm not going to drill down as deeply into those other systems. And that's not because it's not important and not because there aren't a lot of ideas and different diverse ways of setting up a civil service system or setting up a system of appointment. It's just that in this class with sort of limited resources, I'm only going to focus on the biggest questions that are the most important, and elections are extremely important. Now, I'm also today, I just want to kind of give a disclaimer, not going to cover the entire terrain of voting questions and voting systems, if only because that's just a huge, vast terrain. There are good readings for this class on these issues that will go into more depth on election types of election systems, or mixed systems. Actually, the Van Rybroek reading on sortition actually talks about some medieval systems that involved a combination of voting and sortition, expansion and contraction. That's a really very interesting discussion because it shows you not only the theoretical possibilities are for selection mechanisms are very broad, but that historically things that are quite complex have been used in real situations and used effectively and with good result for decades. So just that's kind of my disclaimer, and I'm going to instead of continuing to dance around with the disclaimer, I'm just going to get to the lecture. Now, I have a blank board here, and that's because what I want to do is I want to kind of envision a situation where we're building an electoral system from the ground up. And what we have is, let's just say here is our nation. And what we're going to have is let's just assume we're going to have a very standard 3-branch system of government with judges and a judicial branch, so we'll have to select judges, and a legislative branch, so we'll have to select representatives, and an executive branch. What are the ways that we could use voting? Now, I am going to say that many judicial systems use voting, and it is an important way to get judges and to make them be accountable, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next lecture. But what I do want to do, again, sort of to keep this discussion contained, is to focus only on executive and legislative elections, which are the most common and kind of the most foundational. Certainly not the only office holders, or even necessarily the largest group of office holders, but they are the most important office holders, because the legislators set the foundational law. In fact, in a lot of constitutions, especially the U.S. Constitution, this is definitely true. It's left to the legislature to answer a lot of the fundamental questions of what the democratic society is going to look like. Voting rights, voting procedures, election law, a lot of the questions that we're going to raise today get answered by legislatures, which essentially means that legislatures are often writing the rules for their own selection, which is an interesting question, an interesting topic in democratic theory, because it doesn't seem like they should get to do that. But if not them, then who? Now, the answer is the founders of the Constitution who, and often constitutions, again, the U.S. Constitution is an exception. Doesn't have a whole lot of specifics in it, but some constitutions go to great lengths to specify all of the rules and procedures of the electoral system, so that it's not left in the hands of the people who are going to actually have to compete in that electoral system. But just note that that's actually one of the fundamental choices and differences in democratic systems, both of which are democratic. Leave it up to the legislators to set up the details of the electoral system. And again, that seems like they're the people who are going to be competing in that system, so how can you let them set up the rules? Well, the ultimate check on that is the people themselves. As long as they don't eliminate elections or make the elections be so non-competitive through their rules, they're going to have to run based on the rules that they set up. And so the people can always say, we don't like the electoral rules you've set up for yourselves, so we're going to punish you and we're going to put new people in. And that does happen. That's actually, when we get electoral reform in the United States, it's a result of the people saying, the rules that you wrote for yourself, you like those rules because you're winning under them, but we don't like those rules because they don't seem to us to sufficiently give us a voice in the selection of our public officials. So that does happen. Okay, so we're going to have a legislature, and let's just make it very simple, and we're going to have a 100-seat unicameral legislature. And the selection of a unicameral was really just it's for simplicity purposes. In Module 2, when we look at institutions and arrangements, we're going to talk about the reasons why unicameral versus bicameral legislatures could be chosen, what the purposes are, what the impact. If you if you've ever taken an American politics class with me, you know what I say about the bicameral nature of U.S. Congress and of state legislatures. But we're going to stick to this 100-seat legislature, and we're going to have a unified executive headed by a governor. And that, again, is just really for illustrative purposes, not to say that the unified executive is better than the multiple executive, or that this is a simpler system to set up elections for. It's actually not necessarily, because what we have here is definitely the governor and if we did have a multiple executive where we had a governor and a state treasurer and a secretary of state and an attorney general who all were elected, they would all share one feature with each other, which is they would all be statewide, or in this case, we're going to call it nationwide. Now, we have two different types of elections here, and they pose different kinds of problems or different kinds of issues. And one thing to note about the nationwide or statewide official is that this limits the kinds of electoral systems that are available to us because we're picking one person. When you're picking more than one person for offices, like you have a 100-seat legislature, you have a lot of options. And I'm gonna run through for the legislature, the three big buckets of options. One is that you have a 100-seat legislature where the 100 legislators represent all of the people, right? That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to divide the nation into districts, okay? So we can have an at-large system of representation, or we can have district-based representation. Now, one of the things that a district-based system will require of us is now we then also need an electoral map. When you have an at-large system, you don't need a map. You don't need to draw district boundaries because there are no districts. The unit, the main political unit, in this case I'm calling a nation, has its own boundary, right? And at-large means all 100 people are elected by all of the people to represent all of the people. Now, I said there were three main buckets, and that's because the district-based system has two variants. One is a single member, and the other is a multi-member system. And these are quite different from each other because they open up a lot more possibilities. A single-member district ends up being like a statewide or nationwide election because you have to choose one person. And that limits the options that you can use for your electoral system if you're picking only one person. In this case, you're picking it for a smaller geographic unit, but you're dedicated to finding one winner, right? When you have a race that has one winner, that is a different type of race than when you have 2, 3, 5 winners, right? So with a multi-member district, let's say that we're going to divide this nation into 25 electoral districts of equal population, and the political equality value that I talked about in one of the previous lectures is the reason to have them in equal size. And we're going to have 4 representatives for each of these districts. Now, we're picking 4 people, and that's a different kind of race than if we have 100 different districts, because it means that what we can do is we can use, for example, an electoral voting scheme that allows there to be more than one winner at a time. Or we could use a voting scheme that staggers elections so that we're actually picking only one winner at a time. So you could say we're going to have 4 members per district, and each of those members is going to be up for a 4-year cycle, staggered. So in year 1, all 4 of them are elected, at the beginning of the Constitution, and then the first person in seat number 1 has to run for re-election in year 2, and then the next person has to run for re-election in year 3. So and this is the way it worked in the U.S. Senate, which had staggered terms, is the people who occupied some of the first seats had to run for election before the 4 years were up. But once we're rolling, you get a 4-year term, and only one of the 4 seats in that district is up for election. Or you could say, well, what we want is we want to actually have 2 people running every 2 years so that we have staggered elections still, but instead of having 1 winner, we have 2 winners. Or you could say all 4 seats are going to come up at the same time. And then what that also allows you to do, if you want, and I'm not going to get deep into the weeds of this, but just to show you all of the choices that are available for setting up a legislative electoral scheme, you could say that, okay, we have 25 districts, and each of the districts is going to elect all 4 people at the same time, but only half of the districts are going to have elections every cycle. So we're going to stagger the cycle. Or we're going to say that all of the districts are going to have elections every 2 years, and it's a 2-year seat, or they're going to have it every 4 years for a 4-year seat, so that every 4 years all 100 seats are up for election. Now, when we start talking about institutions and arrangements is when we're going to begin looking more at these kinds of questions of staggered elections versus concurrent elections, because they have different kinds of impact on institutional stability and institutional relations. In the United States, we have both systems used in Congress. The House of Representatives, all members of the House are up for election every 2 years. That means that there could be 100% turnover in theory, right? In reality, that doesn't happen, but in theory, 100% of the members could be new every 2 years. In the Senate, that's impossible because only 1/3 of the seats are up every cycle. So we have both one house that has concurrent elections and the other house that has staggered elections. And that's because they each provide a different kind of stability. Now again, I'll talk a bit more about that and the impact of that and why you would make one choice or the other, or have a hybrid system like we have when we talk about institutions and arrangements. But just again, part of what I'm doing today is not even giving you a comprehensive view of voting, tallying, and winning, so much as just a sense of what the diversity of forms are and the choices that you have to make when you set up a constitutional scheme or reform a constitutional scheme. So if we have a single member district, it really becomes much like a statewide or a nationwide office. You're picking one person each time. If you have a multi-member district, you have a lot of choices. And what I want to talk about is the situation where you're picking more than one member every election. So we have multiple winners because multiple winners opens up multiple options for both balloting and for counting. There are multiple options for balloting in both of these situations, and I'll talk about them in just a second, but there are even more in multi-member. At-large representation means that we're going to choose all 100. And again, it doesn't have to be at the same time. We can actually say, okay, it's going to be a 4-year term, and 50 of those people are elected every 2 years, so that there's only 50% turnover. Or you could make it 1/3 every 2 years and have a 6-year term, or you could make it 1/3 every year and have 3-year terms. There are just so many options available. The only really limiting factor is fractions and ratios, but that's really not that big of a limiting factor. Now, what we can get in an at-large system is one type of election that's not available in a district-based system. both types can make use of, and these are, I'm going to put voting schemes up here. Both types of system can make use of a majority voting scheme or a plurality voting scheme or a multi-tier voting scheme or a or a proportional representation. Now, it's one of the things you're going to notice if you download the type notes is that my type notes are going to be slightly different than the board notes, and that's just kind of one of the things that happens. They both actually represent a good way of dividing these things up. A majority scheme means 50% plus 1 votes is the winner. Plurality means most votes. A multi-tier scheme is one that has multiple phases. More than one phase. And a proportional system awards seats proportional to the percentage of the vote. All three of these can be used in multi-member districts and in at-large. Only this one can be used for at-large representation. So, proportional representation is possible. You cannot use proportional representation here. Now, you can use it in a different form, and it's kind of a problematic form in multi-member district, but you would have to have a lot of members. So, for example, we could divide this country into 10 electoral districts, and each district is represented by 10 people, and then you could use proportional representation to allocate those. And so if Party A gets 60% of the vote, Party A gets 6 of those 10 seats, etc. But while that's theoretically possible, that's actually problematic and cumbersome, and the smaller your body, the more proportional representation actually warps the vote. Because what if, what happens when there's 55% and someone else has 45%? What are the rounding? It's easier the larger number of seats you have. So a large multi-member district could function like an at-large system of representation, but that form doesn't really get used because it's kind of cumbersome. You're either going to use this or one of these two, and you're not going to try to force proportional representation into a large multi-member district. It's theoretically possible, but it's really cumbersome, and it isn't done. So even though I'm mentioning the theoretical possibility of it, I'm going to ignore discussing what it would necessarily be like. Now, the system of proportional representation is actually, it's used very little in the United States, and it's only mostly used in local governments. So it's the most unfamiliar. It's widely used in Europe and around the world in democracies. And the way it works is this. When you cast a ballot, and I'm going to put down here, ballots. Okay. When you cast a ballot, you are casting your ballot for a party. And one of the things about ballots that we can have is candidate ballots versus party ballots. And I'm going to put an asterisk here, again, to note that when you're using a system of proportional representation, you have to have party ballots. That's how it works. These two things match up. You can't use candidate ballots for proportional representation. So if you want to use candidate ballots, in other words, people are voting for a name, not the name of a party, you have to use one of these other systems. And that is very familiar to us. What happens in proportional representation is that the parties are on the ballot, and the parties all have a slate. And that slate lists their actual candidates. So you have a party, and it's really a party slate. I'll put that in parentheses because the name of the party is on the ballot, and then somewhere in the voter pamphlet or in some form of public information is the slate, so that you can see the ordering and the listing. So let's say that there's a party. Well, I'm going to call it, just for narcissistic purposes, the Jack Party, because I founded it, and I'm the leader of it. The Jack Party is going to run for all 100 seats. And let's say that the Jack Party wins 12% of the vote. Well, that means that the top 12 names on our slate, numbers 1 through 12, get seats in the legislature. And unfortunately, the person who's in the 13th slot doesn't get a seat. If we won just 1% more, that person would get it. So when we have a system of proportional representation, you are voting for people, but you're casting your ballot, you're filling out your ballot as a party, right? Now, the other thing that you can have, this is what goes into ballots, is what are your types of choices? And your choices can either be a single choice or multiple choices or a ranking. So let's consider, and I know I'm jumping around a lot, but I think that it's relatively simple stuff, so it doesn't take me to be too orderly. Let's imagine we have a multi-member district with 4 seats, and 2 of those seats are going to be voted on each 2-year cycle for a 4-year term. You could say, okay, we're doing candidate ballots because we're choosing people in a district. And our choices are what? Okay, let's say, so there are 2 seats. Let's say there are 6 candidates. All 6 names will be listed, for sure, right? The question is, how many bubbles can you fill out? Well, a single means 1 bubble. And then what happens is we add those bubbles up, the total number of bubbles for each candidate, and say what percentage of the vote you got. Now, this is where the issue of majority versus plurality comes in, which is that majority requires you to win the office, to win the race, to have 50% plus 1. In a situation where it's possible for there to be more than 2 candidates, the majority majority rule could and has to be prepared for a runoff. And in fact, the reason why there was a runoff for the Georgia Senate seats just a few days ago from when I'm recording this is because Georgia has a majoritarian Senate election system. Most states have a plurality system. If there are 3 candidates or 5 candidates, whoever gets the most votes, whatever that percentage is, you got 42% of the vote in a 3-way race, you're the winner of that race. In majority rules require you to get 50% plus 1. Plurality is just most votes. So if we're running for 2 seats, you can't really use a majoritarian system. But if we're running for 1 seat, you certainly can, or you can use a plurality system. Both of those choices are up. Or you could use a multi-tier system, which we sort of have unofficially in our 2-party system, because what we have is we have party primaries, which are the first tier, which basically each party gets a slot on the final ballot, right? And they hold an election to decide what name is going to go on that final ballot, and then there's the general election. So primary elections and general elections are an example of what a multi-tier system looks like. Now, if you have a multi-tier system that is nonpartisan, and that's another thing about ballots, and I'm going to put this over here, we can use partisan or nonpartisan, is that in a partisan ballot, you're going to, if you have a multi-tier system, then you're going to have a multi-tier system with a partisan ballot because each party gets a slot, and then they hold an election to figure out who gets that slot. You can also have a nonpartisan multi-tier system, which is what Portland has for its citywide offices, for city council and mayor, which is there's a first election, and we call it the primary election, but really you could just call it the first election in May of election years, and everybody who wants to run for that office runs. It's a majoritarian rule that if you get 50% plus 1 of the vote in that first tier, you skip the general election and get the office. But if you don't, what happens is the top 2 vote getters go to the next tier. We call it the general election, but it's really the second tier election. And then there's a majoritarian rule there as well. And with 2 candidates, it's 50% of plus 1 of the vote automatically when there's only 2 candidates. Now, what happens when there's a write-in candidate, which actually just did happen here in Portland in 2020 for the mayoral race? Well, for one thing, part of what our multi-tier system allows is for there to be write-in candidates at both tiers. That's not a requirement. You could ban write-in votes at the second tier. Georgia had that rule. You weren't allowed, some people were saying, we're going to write in Donald J. Trump for senator for Georgia. But that's not allowed by Georgia state law because Georgia they want to make sure that unless there's an actual tie, that the runoff is going to produce a 50% plus 1. Our system is majoritarian-ish in the sense that we have two tiers. There's a majoritarian rule that if in either tier you get 50% plus 1, you're the winner. But it's ish because you're allowed to write in candidates, and this actually did just happen 2 months ago here in Portland. The write-in candidate got 13% of the vote, depriving both of the balloted candidates from getting 50% of the vote, but our rules, which allow write-in, don't require another runoff. They give the victory to the one with the most votes. So it's supposed to be a majoritarian system, and it's set up to be one. It's a multi-tier system to be majoritarian, but it ends up being, in this kind of situation, it ends up being a plurality system. And Ted Wheeler got elected mayor, re-elected mayor in 2020 with less than 50% of the vote, which is really interesting because just in terms of outcomes, in 2016 when he ran the first time, he won 50%, more than 50% of the vote in the first tier. There was no general election for mayor in 2016 because Ted Wheeler won in May and didn't have to run again in November. He fell just short of it this year, and so there had to be a runoff. But then Teresa Rayford ran a write-in campaign and got 13% of the vote, and probably denied Sarah Anarone, probably divided her vote, the challenger vote, the non-incumbent vote, so that Ted Wheeler actually won a second. So he won in 1 out of 2 tiers the first time with 50% plus 1. And he won the second time in a 2-tiered vote without actually reaching 50%, which is an interesting result. And here's one of the questions that this kind of thing raises for those who are setting up a democratic system. Should we think that the result of our 2020 election was the most democratic result we could have? Or should we have, 1, prevented write-ins, or 2, allowed write-ins but required a third election, an actual, say January runoff, if none of the candidates in the second tier got 50% plus 1 of the vote? That would have been a very interesting kind of system. So these are the kinds of questions that can get addressed, and we just actually lived through an election that produced one of these oddball results, but the oddball results actually happen way more often than you would think given these sort of complex systems. So back to the choices. Single choice, every voter gets to fill in one bubble. Multiple choice means it's not like a multiple choice question on an exam where you have to figure out what the right answer is. Multiple choice means you get to fill in more than one bubble. And the number of bubbles you get to fill in is set by law. So back to my example where we're talking about a single member district, a multi-member district with 4 representatives, but 2 of them get elected each time. Every election, there's going to be 2 winners. And so we could say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to put all the names on the ballot and we're going to give every voter 2 bubbles to fill out. And the 2 candidates who get the most votes, because at this point there's no percentages anymore, who get the most numerical votes, the top 2 get those 2 seats. That's one way to do it. You could also give voters 3 choices and take the top 2. You could also use a single choice and take the top 2 instead of take the majoritarian view. So there are a lot of options, but multiple choice basically says to voters, well, you're getting 2 representatives and fill out 2 bubbles. And so to win, I'm going to air quote that one because winning just means you get the office. You don't actually have to come in first. You have to only come in first or second. Another way that you could have this done is through rank preference voting. Let's say there are 6 candidates. What you do is you order them from 1 through 6. You can write the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 next to each name. And typically in these kinds of systems, voters aren't required to fill out the entire ranking. They're like, I don't know 5 and 6, I don't even know these people. I'm not going to figure out the difference. So you just say, oh, that's my top choice, there's my second choice, that's my third choice. In reality, most voters, when rank preference voting is used, don't go beyond their third choice, even when they're allowed to. And then some ranking systems only allow you to take your top 3. If there are 6, 10 candidates, however many candidates there are, you're only allowed to do your top 3. So that is the choices available for candidate elections. Now quickly back to the proportional party slate, because I think it's pretty clear already, but I want to wrap it up so that I don't have to talk about it anymore. Basically, this is going to be, you could give multiple choices, and you could give ranked choices in a PR system as well. You could say, okay, I want to give, you can't actually give ranked choices, I'm sorry, I misspoke. You can give multiple choices or single choices. You can say, okay, there are 100 seats, we're going to distribute them proportionally. Every voter gets to fill in 2 parties. And this would be a choice that would be made to encourage multiple parties to run more than just, say, 3 or 4. You would end up, say, having 6 or 7, because if a voter can give 2 choices, and then what happens is each party gets the number of votes that are filled out for it, and then percentages are determined from the total number of votes and the fraction that a particular party has. So if we have 1 million voters, and all 1 million voters fill out 2 bubbles, we're going to have 2 million votes, and so whatever percentage of the 2 million votes the Jack party gets, and party B, and whatever other parties you want to call them, that's the number of seats they get out of 100. Let's say that only half of the voters actually fill out 2 bubbles, and the other fill out only 1 because they don't have a second choice. Then there will be 1.5 million votes with 1 million people, and then you calculate your percentages based on the 1.5 million and distribute them that way. Sometimes the math can get a little spreadsheety and a little bit kind of head cocking, like how does that exactly work? But and I won't go into a lot of the math right now with this either, again, because of time.